In 1908, the city had no room for him. His dream of becoming an artist, a dream he had nurtured since childhood, had crumbled twice before. Once when the Academy of Fine Arts had rejected him, then again when his sparse talent was deemed insufficient. The rejection had stung, but not as deeply as the knowledge that he was utterly alone in the world, with no family to lean on and no future to look forward to. With nothing but a few crowns inherited from his late father, he wandered the streets, scraping together enough to survive by selling his reproductions of Vienna's monuments and landscapes. The work was mundane, the pay meager, rarely more than a few crowns a day, just enough to secure a bed in the dingy, overcrowded hostels that became his temporary homes. He would often lie awake at night, the sound of street noise creeping through thin walls, wondering if there was more to life than this endless struggle. In the mornings, he walked the streets with his bundle of postcards, offering them to merchants and passers-by who paid no attention to his desperate attempts at making a sale. His drawings, simple sketches of churches, bridges, and monuments, failed to captivate anyone. There were moments when he felt like an invisible figure, drifting through the world without leaving a mark. He found temporary relief in odd jobs, shoveling snow, carrying luggage at train stations, but these offered no hope of change. His dreams of grandeur, of making a name for himself, seemed impossibly distant. Yet, deep within him something stirred. He didn't belong here, he believed. The world had yet to see the true potential of the man who stood before it. It wasn't his art, nor his ability to sell postcards that would define him. No, he knew the world was waiting for something more, something far more powerful than talent or beauty. It was politics. It was power. And so, in 1913, with nothing left to lose, Hitler left Vienna for Munich, a city that would become the stage for his rise to prominence. The streets of Munich were different. There was energy here, a sense of urgency that matched his own internal drive. He arrived at the city's bustling cafes and beer halls, where the air was thick with political debate. It was here, among the clinking of steins and the fervor of nationalist sentiment, that Hitler found his new calling. He began to weave himself into the tapestry of radical political circles, aligning himself with groups that echoed his discontent with the state of Germany. He wasn't the only one dissatisfied with the current order. There were many, all searching for something greater, something to give their lives meaning beyond poverty and despair. It was in these disillusioned crowds that Hitler found his audience, and he soon learned that the path to power did not require wealth or fine art, but the ability to speak to the masses, to ignite their fears and aspirations. His speeches, delivered with fiery passion and unwavering certainty, began to captivate a growing number of supporters. They were drawn to his raw energy, his willingness to voice the frustrations that simmered beneath the surface of German society. And as he spoke, as he gained followers and built connections with influential figures, he realized something. Power was the true currency in this world. It was a currency far more valuable than crowns or postcards. And with this newfound understanding, Hitler set his sights on something greater, a fortune that would not come from art, but from the manipulation of the very people who had once ignored him. By the time the war ended in 1918, Hitler had nothing to show for his efforts but the remnants of his earlier life. A few failed endeavors, a tattered reputation, and a fractured Germany. Yet, even in the darkest days of defeat, he clung to the idea that power would be his. It was no longer just about survival. It was about transformation of himself, of his nation, and of the world. And with that unyielding belief, Adolf Hitler began his ascent, not as an artist, but as a leader whose ambition would shape the future in ways that no one could have predicted. His rise was only beginning, and with it, his fortune would grow, built on the back of political manipulation, nationalist fervor, and a relentless will to power. What began with rejection and poverty would soon transform into something far more dangerous. His wealth would not be earned in the traditional sense, but through the calculated exploitation of others. And as he carved his path to dominance, there would be no turning back. Adolf Hitler sat alone in his prison cell, the cold stone walls pressing in on him as he stared at the blank pages in front of him. It was 1924 and he had been sentenced to prison for his failed coup, the Munich Putsch, an attempt to seize power that ended in chaos and defeat. But Hitler had always been a man who found opportunity in even the darkest of moments. Behind the iron bars of Landsberg Fortress, his mind worked tirelessly, already turning the political failure into something far greater. His book, Mein Kampf, was born here, in the solitude of his confinement. In the early days, the book was nothing more than a desperate attempt to solidify his political beliefs. Dictated to his loyal companion Rudolf Hess, Mein Kampf was a manifesto, a blueprint for the future of Germany. But at first, it was little more than a collection of angry words, a rambling tale of his struggles, his philosophy, and his vision for a nation dominated by his ideology. Hitler knew this book was more than just an autobiography. It was a weapon, a tool to spread his ideas and garner support. The manuscript would become his calling card, his way of reaching the masses and securing his place in history. Yet, the early days of Mein Kampf's existence were far from glamorous. The book was not the instant success Hitler had envisioned. Published in 1925 by the Franz Aheyer Verlag, it quickly became clear that the book would not make him a fortune. Sales were sluggish, barely reaching a few thousand copies in its first year. For a man who had already begun to build a following, this was a frustrating setback. The royalties were meager, and the book's impact seemed limited to only a small group of radical nationalists. Hitler, however, was not a man who gave up easily. He pored over the book sales figures with growing impatience. The book had failed to capture the public's imagination the way he had hoped. But Hitler was nothing if not relentless. He was no longer just a failed artist. He was a strategist, a master manipulator who understood the power of the written word. He realized that if he could tie his political rise to the book, he could force its way into the hearts and minds of the German people. As the 1930s dawned, so did the rise of the Nazi Party. The Great Depression had left Germany in tatters, and the people were hungry for change. They were tired of the Weimar Republic's ineffectiveness, disillusioned with the political elites who had failed them. It was in this chaos that Hitler seized his moment. He was no longer just a failed artist or a fringe political figure. He was a man with a vision, and the vision he had for Germany was made clear through the pages of Mein Kampf. In 1930, as the Nazi Party's popularity soared, Mein Kampf began to find its true purpose. The book, which had once struggled to gain attention, was now becoming a powerful propaganda tool. As Hitler's influence grew, so did the book sales. In 1932, as the Nazi Party's power reached new heights, Mein Kampf became mandatory reading for Nazi supporters and party members. Civil servants, teachers, and soldiers were encouraged to own a copy. The German government implemented a systematic distribution policy, gifting copies of the book to newlyweds and making it compulsory in schools and public offices. What had once been a book with modest sales now had the full backing of the Nazi state. Hitler's financial fortunes began to shift. By 1933, when Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany, Mein Kampf was no longer just a book. It was a symbol of the Nazi regime itself. Sales skyrocketed, and Hitler, who had once struggled to make ends meet, now reaped the rewards. Royalties poured in, with Hitler receiving between 1.82 and 2.16 Reichsmarks for each copy sold. By 1934 and 1935, annual sales exceeded 1 million copies, generating millions in income. Mein Kampf was not just a book, it was the economic backbone of Hitler's personal empire, a direct result of his political power. The rise of the book mirrored the rise of Hitler himself. The more the Nazi Party grew, the more the book became embedded in the fabric of German society. It wasn't just a financial success, it was a tool of indoctrination, a means to shape public opinion and ensure the loyalty of the masses. Through its pages, Hitler communicated his vision for a new Germany, one built on his ideology of nationalism, militarism, and Aryan supremacy. As the book became a staple in German homes, so did Hitler's influence over the nation's political and economic future. Yet even as Mein Kampf became the backbone of Hitler's personal wealth, there was a growing sense that the book's true impact had only just begun. What started as a failed political manifesto had evolved into a weapon of propaganda, a tool that would help Hitler build an empire both politically and financially. With every new copy sold, his fortune grew, as did his power. By the time the world was plunged into the chaos of war, Adolf Hitler had already started building his empire, one page at a time. Mein Kampf became more than just a book. It became a foundation for his dictatorship. The royalties from it would fund his personal luxuries, finance his campaigns, and help cement his grip on Germany. As the Nazi Party's rise to power continued, the book's sales were a constant reminder of Hitler's ability to turn even the most modest beginnings into a massive fortune. And with that fortune, Hitler would shape the course of history, leaving a legacy that would be defined not only by his political ideology but by the wealth that sustained it. In January 1933, as Adolf Hitler took the reins of the German government, the atmosphere in Germany was charged with anticipation. The country was reeling from the effects of the Great Depression, unemployment was rampant, and political instability had left the public desperate for a strong leader. Hitler had promised a new era, one of national unity, pride, and strength. But as his political power grew, so did his wealth. He was no longer just a radical figure fighting for influence. He had become the head of state, and his wealth was now tied directly to the machinery of government. Before Hitler became chancellor, Mein Kampf was a book known mainly among his supporters, a piece of nationalist propaganda that few took seriously outside the radical right-wing circles. It was sold at bookstores, but its reach was limited, and its financial success was modest. However, with his appointment as chancellor, everything changed. The Nazi Party quickly set to work turning Mein Kampf from a niche political text into a mandatory part of German life. It wasn't just a book anymore. It became a symbol of the Nazi regime, a tool of ideological indoctrination, and a state-sanctioned product that everyone had to own. The government launched an aggressive campaign to ensure that every German citizen, regardless of social standing, would have a copy of Mein Kampf. Newlyweds received the book as a gift from the state. Public officials, teachers, and even soldiers were required to have it in their possession. It wasn't a mere suggestion. It was policy. Public libraries were ordered to stock copies, and schools incorporated it into their curriculum. For the Nazi Party, Mein Kampf was no longer just Hitler's personal manifesto. It was an essential part of their propaganda machine. Each copy of the book represented not just the dissemination of Hitler's ideology, but a direct line to his wealth. As millions of copies were distributed, the financial windfall for Hitler was staggering. In 1933, nearly 1 million copies were sold, far more than in all the previous years combined. The German state's systematic distribution of the book ensured that every household, every government office, every institution was filled with Hitler's words. As sales surged, so did Hitler's royalties. With each copy sold, he earned between 1.82 and 2.16 Reichsmarks. By the end of 1933, his income from Mein Kampf alone had climbed into the millions of Reichsmarks, turning what was once a modest literary venture into a major source of personal wealth. The financial success of Mein Kampf was just one part of the equation. Hitler's political position allowed him to secure other sources of income that fueled his personal fortune. Industrialists and businessmen, eager to align themselves with the regime for fear of reprisal or to gain favor with the Nazi government, began pouring money into the Nazi Party's coffers. The Adolf Hitler Spender, a fund designed to gather donations from Germany's industrial elite, became another crucial financial resource. Contributions came from companies like IG Farben, Daimler-Benz, and Krupp, as the Nazi regime offered lucrative contracts, tax breaks, and protection in exchange for political support. These donations weren't just financial transactions. They were a form of political patronage, solidifying Hitler's control over both the economy and the political landscape. In return for their financial backing, businessmen received preferential treatment, government contracts, and exemptions from union interference. The symbiotic relationship between Hitler's political power and the economic elite was mutually beneficial, as both parties were invested in the regime's success. But the true financial windfall came from Hitler's newfound control over the state's resources. The German government, under Hitler's command, began to operate as his personal bank. The state's vast coffers funded his lavish lifestyle, paying for his residences, transportation, and security. The Reich's treasury also provided for his personal expenses, blurring the lines between public and private funds. He didn't need to distinguish between what was state money and what was personal money. Everything was at his disposal. Hitler's wealth was further amplified by the fact that he was exempt from taxes. In 1932, before becoming chancellor, Hitler owed significant tax debts. But once in power, he used his political influence to have these debts forgiven. In a country where the tax rate for the wealthy was 40%, his exemption meant that every Reichsmark he earned, whether from book royalties, donations, or state resources, was untouched by taxation. This allowed Hitler to amass a fortune that, by the mid-1930s, placed him among the richest men in Germany. The transformation was nothing short of extraordinary. The man who had once struggled to sell postcards in the streets of Vienna was now living a life of unprecedented luxury. His income from Mein Kampf, combined with industrial donations and the direct access to state resources, made him one of the wealthiest men in Europe. He was no longer just the head of the Nazi Party. He was a man with vast financial power, able to shape the future of Germany and Europe with both his political influence and his personal wealth. As Hitler's political power grew, so did his financial empire. The sales of Mein Kampf continued to climb, and the Nazi regime's support from Germany's industrial giants ensured that his wealth would continue to grow. But this was just the beginning. With his political rise, Hitler was able to secure even more lucrative opportunities, turning his fortune into something that would fund not only his personal lifestyle but the expansion of Nazi ideology throughout Europe. By 1933, Hitler's wealth was no longer just a product of his book sales. It was a direct result of his control over the Nazi Party and the German state. His personal fortune was intertwined with the fate of the nation, and as the regime's influence spread, so did his income. Mein Kampf was no longer just a book. It was the key to a fortune that would fuel the Nazi machine for years to come, ensuring that Hitler's political power was matched only by the wealth that flowed from it. Hitler's rise to power was as much about politics as it was about wealth, and he knew exactly how to weave the two together. By the time he was appointed Chancellor of Germany in 1933, he had already begun securing financial backing from Germany's industrial elite, men who saw in his rise an opportunity for power, wealth, and influence. The Nazi Party was not merely a political movement. It had become a financial powerhouse, and Hitler, the man at its helm, was its most significant beneficiary. In the early 1930s, industrial magnates like Fritz Thyssen, who owned one of Germany's largest steel companies, were among the first to offer significant financial support to Hitler's cause. Thyssen, along with other major industrialists, believed that Hitler's radical nationalist agenda would protect their business interests and offer the stability that Germany desperately needed after the tumult of the Weimar Republic. In exchange for their contributions, Hitler guaranteed a government that would prioritize the interests of big business, tax breaks, protection from labor unions, and state contracts for military rearmament. The relationship between Hitler and the industrialists was symbiotic. Companies like IG Farben, which controlled much of Germany's chemical industry, Daimler-Benz, the company behind luxury vehicles, and Krupp, one of the largest manufacturers of armaments, saw their wealth grow as the Nazi regime expanded. These industrial giants, often referred to as the four-year plan companies, knew that their investments in Hitler would pay dividends, both in political power and in financial returns. Hitler, for his part, understood the value of these alliances. By 1933, as his party's fortunes grew, he was able to use the vast sums of money poured into his campaign to further secure his position. The donations, often funneled through organizations like the Adolf Hitler Spender, did not just fund Nazi propaganda. They funded Hitler's personal wealth. In return, these businessmen were rewarded with government contracts, tax breaks, and, in many cases, monopolies in strategic sectors. They had a direct hand in building the Nazi war machine, ensuring that both the state and their private enterprises thrived in unison. But this exchange of wealth was not limited to political favors. Hitler's personal finances were closely tied to these industrial contributions. His private bank accounts, which were never subjected to scrutiny, grew as donations flowed in. Industrialists, seeking to protect their wealth and interests, ensured that Hitler's coffers were constantly filled. For the first time, Hitler was not just a struggling politician. He was a man who controlled vast financial resources. And then there was the matter of taxes. In a country where the wealthy were required to pay substantial taxes on their income, Hitler was exempt. Before he rose to power, Hitler had faced significant tax debts, amounting to hundreds of thousands of Reichsmarks. But once he became chancellor, his financial troubles evaporated. The Nazi regime enacted special tax laws that exempted Hitler from paying any personal taxes. His income, whether from main camp royalties, business donations, or state salaries, was completely untaxed. In a nation where the highest tax rate for the wealthy hovered around 40%, this exemption effectively allowed Hitler to keep all of his income, an extraordinary privilege that added millions to his personal fortune. This exemption from taxes not only magnified Hitler's wealth, but it also allowed him to funnel state resources directly into his personal accounts. While ordinary Germans struggled under the weight of economic hardship, Hitler lived a life of excess, his fortune growing exponentially without the burden of taxation. For a man who had once lived in poverty, the transformation was nothing short of miraculous. The symbiotic relationship between the state, industrialists, and Hitler's personal finances ensured that he would remain both politically and financially untouchable. Hitler's wealth, built on the backs of industrialists, tax exemptions, and government resources, was no longer just a symbol of financial success. It had become a tool of power. As his political control over Germany tightened, his access to state resources allowed him to indulge in the kind of luxury that only the wealthiest men in the world could imagine. No longer a struggling artist selling postcards on the streets of Vienna, Hitler was now the master of a vast empire that not only secured his financial future, but also allowed him to live in unprecedented opulence. The Berghof, his mountaintop retreat in Bavaria, became a symbol of this newfound luxury. Nestled in the picturesque hills of Berchtesgaden, the Berghof was Hitler's private residence, where he spent much of his time away from the pressures of Berlin. What had started as a modest house was transformed into a sprawling estate, complete with panoramic terraces, a private library, and a cinema room. The extensive gardens and the luxurious furnishings were funded directly by the state, blurring the lines between public and private resources. Hitler's residence was not just a home. It was a fortress of power, a place where he could retreat from the world and bask in the wealth that his political success had afforded him. But the Berghof was just the beginning. As his wealth grew, so did his collection of luxury vehicles, each more extravagant than the last. Hitler had an extensive fleet of Mercedes-Benz cars, including the legendary 770K Grosser limousines, each armored and designed to provide him with both security and comfort. These vehicles, worth tens of thousands of Reichsmarks each, were paid for by the state, further illustrating how Hitler used public funds for his personal enjoyment. In addition to his limousines, Hitler also owned all-terrain vehicles like the Mercedes-Benz G4 and Maybach Zeppelin DS8, which were customized to suit his needs. His love of luxury transport was not just a personal indulgence. It was a statement of his newfound status, a symbol of his power. Alongside his fleet of vehicles, Hitler's private collection of art and antiques began to swell. His tastes ran to European classical art, with a particular fondness for the works of the Renaissance, Baroque, and German Romanticism. Between 1936 and 1939, agents working for Hitler scoured Europe's galleries, amassing paintings, sculptures, and rare antiques. Many of these pieces were acquired under duress, as Jewish collectors were forced to sell their treasures for a fraction of their true worth. The plundering of art was not only about collecting, it was about power. Each painting, each sculpture was a symbol of Nazi supremacy, an assertion of the regime's cultural dominance. The most ambitious project, however, was Hitler's plan for the Führer Museum in Linz, which he envisioned as the largest and most important art museum in Europe. The museum was to house the thousands of pieces Hitler had acquired during his reign, along with works he personally selected. Although the museum was never completed, the art collection that Hitler amassed became one of the most extensive private collections in history. His wealth, built on industrial donations, tax exemptions, and state resources, was now channeled into a personal collection of cultural power, a physical manifestation of his dominance over both Germany and Europe. Hitler's use of state resources to finance his luxurious lifestyle went beyond art and automobiles. The German government provided for his every need. His official residences, his personal security, his service personnel, all funded by the public treasury. His lavish lifestyle was built on the backs of those who supported the regime, who paid their taxes while Hitler remained exempt from his own obligations. For Hitler, the state was not a tool for public service. It was a means to consolidate his personal power and wealth. And as the years passed, his wealth continued to grow, fed by the inexhaustible resources of a state that functioned primarily to serve his desires. In the end, Hitler's wealth was not just about luxury, it was about control. The more he amassed, the more he solidified his position as one of the most powerful men in the world. And with each painting added to his collection, each vehicle added to his fleet, he was reminding the world that his power was not only political but economic, built on the exploitation of the very system he controlled. His art collection, his palaces, his lavish lifestyle were not simply the fruits of his labor. They were his legacy, a symbol of a man who had used politics, industry, and wealth to carve his place in history. As the war raged across Europe, Hitler didn't just seek victory. He sought treasure. His ambitions extended beyond conquest. They were driven by an insatiable hunger for wealth, and he knew that Europe's vast cultural and economic resources could fuel both his personal fortune and his ideological ambitions. The Nazi regime's war machine wasn't just about military power, it was also about pillaging the riches of the nations it conquered. Art, gold, and rare jewels were taken as spoils of war, transported across the continent to feed Hitler's ever-expanding private collection. From the moment German troops stormed into Poland in 1939, the plundering began. State treasures, private collections, and national archives were systematically looted. But it wasn't just about what could be sold, it was about power, status, and control. Hitler's agents scoured Poland for artworks, historical documents, and religious artifacts. The grandiose palaces of Warsaw were emptied, while priceless manuscripts and paintings disappeared, either to be hidden in secret deposits or sent to Germany, where they were to be catalogued for his ever-growing collection. But Poland was just the beginning. As German forces marched across Europe, their path was marked by the confiscation of Europe's cultural legacy. France, Belgium, Greece, each country fell victim to a meticulously planned and organized operation that sought to strip their treasures. In France, the Louvre Museum was targeted, with agents focusing on acquiring works by Rembrandt, Vermeer, and other European masters. Artworks were taken not just for their value but for their symbolic power. Hitler wanted the cultural symbols of the nations he conquered to be a part of his vision for a new Europe, an empire of Nazi supremacy. Belgium and the Netherlands were similarly plundered, with agents requisitioning complete private collections. In the wealthy homes of Jewish families, priceless works of art were taken for a fraction of their worth. Hitler's personal art agents, who had been scouring European galleries for years, now had free rein to acquire the best pieces, often using economic pressure to force Jewish collectors into selling their treasures at a fraction of their value. These works were then transported to Germany, many destined for what would become the Führer Museum in Linz, a monument to Hitler's vision of a cultural empire. This systematic looting wasn't just about filling private rooms with art, it was about consolidating power. The stolen treasures were meant to symbolize the regime's triumph over the nations it had defeated, and the Führer Museum would become the crown jewel in this collection. But it wasn't just about art. Hitler's appetite for wealth extended to the plunder of gold, currency, and even personal valuables from the conquered nations. This wealth, gathered through terror and exploitation, would finance not only the Nazi regime but Hitler's own personal luxuries, from his palaces to his private collections. As the war continued, so did the looting. The sheer scale of the operation was staggering. Entire museums, private collections, and royal treasures were stripped bare. In every country under German control, Hitler's agents operated with near impunity, taking whatever they could carry. The wealth of Europe was funneled directly into Hitler's hands, cementing his status not only as a political leader but as one of the richest men in the world. While the world burned, Hitler's wealth found refuge in Switzerland, protected by secrecy and corruption. As the Nazi regime expanded its reach across Europe, Hitler and his closest allies knew that their fortune could not remain exposed. With Allied forces advancing from all directions, the need for secrecy and discretion became paramount. Switzerland, a neutral country with a reputation for banking confidentiality, became the ideal place to stash the Reich's ill-gotten gains. As early as the mid-1930s, before the war even began, Nazi officials had already begun transferring large sums of money to Swiss banks. The country's banks offered a sanctuary for Nazi gold, foreign currency, and other assets, ensuring that they would remain out of the reach of Allied forces. Hitler himself, as well as other high-ranking Nazi officials like Heinrich Himmler and Joseph Goebbels, were known to have accounts in Switzerland, often under pseudonyms or using intermediaries. The secrecy of Swiss banking laws made it nearly impossible for the Allies to track the movements of these funds. The role of Swiss banks in safeguarding Nazi wealth cannot be overstated. The bank's neutrality during the war allowed them to act as a safe harbor for Nazi assets, with many Swiss institutions eagerly accepting deposits from the Reich. The transfers were often done through shell companies, which acted as intermediaries, masking the true ownership of the funds. In this way, billions of Reichsmarks looted from occupied territories, from industrial contributions, and from the personal fortunes of Nazi leaders were hidden in numbered accounts. But the true complexity of these financial operations went far beyond simple bank accounts. Hitler's allies moved gold reserves and other valuables into Switzerland through a network of intermediaries, where they were stored in secret vaults and hidden from view. Some of this gold was melted down and reminted, ready to be traded on the international market once the war was over. Other treasures, including artwork, documents, and rare jewels, were hidden in safe deposit boxes, away from the prying eyes of the Allies. In addition to Switzerland, other neutral countries like Liechtenstein and Sweden were also used to shelter Nazi wealth. In some cases, Nazi officials arranged for the transfer of assets to these countries under the guise of business transactions or personal investments. These covert operations were designed to ensure that Hitler's fortune would remain intact, even as the Reich faced its inevitable collapse. But the true scale of these operations remains largely shrouded in mystery. The complex web of accounts, false names, and shell companies makes it nearly impossible to determine exactly how much money and gold were hidden away in these secretive havens. When the war ended, the full extent of these hidden fortunes would only begin to surface. Swiss banks, pressured by international investigations, were forced to release some of their records. But much of the documentation had been destroyed during the war, and what remained was fragmentary at best. The mystery of Hitler's wealth in Switzerland would continue to haunt historians and treasure hunters for decades, as the exact amount of Nazi gold and assets hidden in Swiss banks remains unknown. As the Third Reich crumbled, so did the vaults of Hitler's personal empire. With the Soviet forces closing in from the east and the Allies advancing from the west, Hitler's once mighty regime began to disintegrate in the final months of the war. The frantic efforts to evacuate the Reich's treasures were a last-ditch attempt to hide the wealth that had fueled Nazi power for years. Gold vanished, artworks disappeared, and hidden assets were buried in the ruins of war. But where did they go? Who took them? And why is the mystery still unsolved? In the final days of the war, as Berlin lay under siege, Martin Bormann, Hitler's personal secretary and financial manager, oversaw the desperate evacuation of the Reich's treasures. Gold reserves, artworks, and priceless documents were hastily packed up and moved to various locations across Germany and Austria. Bormann knew that if these assets fell into Allied hands, the financial legacy of the Nazi regime would be exposed. But in the chaos of the war's final days, many of these treasures were lost, either deliberately hidden or simply abandoned as the regime collapsed. As Soviet and American troops stormed through Germany, Nazi officials scrambled to move gold and artworks into safe locations. Salt mines, caves, and underground bunkers became makeshift vaults for the Reich's looted treasures. In one of the most famous discoveries, Allied forces found more than 8,000 gold bars in the Merkers salt mine, along with billions of Reichsmarks in foreign currency and tons of silver. But these discoveries only scratched the surface. Numerous other locations were emptied before the Allies could arrive, and the full extent of what was hidden remains unknown. The destruction of records and the deliberate erasure of Nazi financial documentation made it nearly impossible to trace the whereabouts of the wealth that had been moved in the final days of the war. As Bormann and other Nazi officials disappeared into the chaos, the trail of the Reich's hidden treasures grew colder. In the end, much of what was hidden never surfaced, and the mystery of Hitler's fortune remains unsolved to this day. After Germany's surrender in May 1945, the hunt for Hitler's hidden treasures began in earnest. The Allied powers, particularly the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union, launched coordinated efforts to uncover the full extent of the Nazi regime's looted wealth. But even with their vast networks of investigators, intelligence officers, and financial experts, the Allies struggled to unravel the mysteries of Hitler's fortune. Hidden in salt mines, caves, and secret Swiss accounts, his wealth defied recovery. The U.S. Treasury Department established a specialized unit to investigate the Nazi regime's financial operations, focusing on the vast amounts of gold and foreign currency that had been transferred to neutral countries. They also pursued leads on the hidden art collections and other valuables that had been looted during the war. The British, meanwhile, concentrated their efforts on investigating Nazi real estate holdings and attempting to trace the flow of money to Swiss banks. The Soviet Union, after occupying Berlin, seized documents and personal items from Hitler's bunker, many of which contained clues about the whereabouts of his fortune. Despite these extensive efforts, the search for Hitler's hidden wealth was fraught with obstacles. The deliberate destruction of records by Nazi officials in the final days of the war made it difficult to track the movement of money and assets. The systematic looting of art and treasures across Europe had left a trail of missing pieces, and many of the treasures taken were never properly catalogued. As the war ended and Europe was divided into occupation zones, the search for the missing wealth became even more complicated, with each occupying power pursuing its own agenda. By the 1950s, several significant discoveries were made. Gold reserves and foreign currency were found in deposits in Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. Some of the art collections looted by the Nazis were located in various caches, and works by Rembrandt, Vermeer, and other masters were returned to museums. However, many pieces remained missing, and the question of how much wealth had actually been hidden by the Nazis remained unanswered. Despite their best efforts, the Allies could not fully recover the vast fortune that had been amassed by Hitler and his regime. As decades passed, the hunt continued. Yet, Hitler's fortune remains one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries. Where did the gold go? What happened to the priceless artworks? And why does his fortune still captivate the world's imagination? The final chapter of the story is not one of resolution, but of enduring enigma, as questions about the lost treasures of the Third Reich continue to stir fascination and speculation. In the years following the fall of the Nazi regime, the Allies combed through Europe, recovering what they could of the wealth that had been systematically looted during the war. Yet, for all their efforts, much of Hitler's fortune remains lost to history. The gold that was transferred to Swiss banks, the priceless artworks that were hidden away in salt mines and caves. These treasures continue to elude recovery, their final resting places unknown. For years, treasure hunters, historians, and researchers have pored over records, sifted through declassified documents, and conducted excavation after excavation, only to find tantalizing clues and partial discoveries. The story of Hitler's lost wealth is filled with fragmented pieces. Some of the most significant discoveries came in the post-war years, when Allied forces uncovered gold bars and foreign currency stashed away in the Merker salt mine, and thousands of looted art pieces were found in the Alta salt mines. But these were only the beginning, and as investigations stretched into the 1950s and beyond, the full extent of the treasures hidden by the Nazis remained elusive. The most famous of these treasures, the artworks, looted from occupied countries like France, Belgium, and Poland, represented not just the material wealth of Europe, but a cultural heritage that Hitler had sought to control and manipulate for his own ends. Yet, for every painting returned to a museum, another vanished without a trace. Some works of art were documented in Nazi inventories but never found in Allied search operations. Paintings by Vermeer, Rembrandt, and Caravaggio, which had been forcibly taken from Jewish collectors or royal families, remained hidden. Their absence was particularly conspicuous when specialists compared inventories of confiscated works with the recovery lists from the Allied efforts. For decades, the world was left with gaps in the historical record, treasures whose fate was uncertain, lost in the chaos of war. Meanwhile, rumors began to spread. Among the most enduring was the belief that Hitler had not only hidden treasures across Europe, but had arranged for substantial amounts of wealth to be transferred to South America. Reports of Nazi officials fleeing to countries like Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil after the war, along with stories of shipments of gold and foreign currency arriving in these countries, fueled speculation. The idea that Nazi treasures were hidden away in South America became a widely held belief, especially as intelligence reports from the 1940s and 1950s mentioned unusual financial transactions, as well as accounts in South American banks linked to former Nazi officials. Despite this, no definitive evidence has ever surfaced to confirm these claims. While some Nazi figures, including the infamous Joseph Mengele, are believed to have fled to South America, the supposed Nazi loot remains elusive. The Argentine government even initiated investigations into claims of hidden treasure, but none of these searches resulted in the discovery of significant Nazi wealth. Could it have been transported across the Atlantic, buried in the jungles of South America, or hidden in caves waiting to be unearthed? The mystery persists, tantalizing historians, treasure hunters, and conspiracy theorists alike. The intrigue surrounding Hitler's fortune is further compounded by the role of Swiss banks, which were used to shield Nazi wealth during the war. Despite pressure from the international community, Switzerland's banking system has remained tight-lipped about the full extent of the deposits linked to the Reich. While some records were released under duress, many accounts were held under pseudonyms or through shell companies, making it nearly impossible to trace the full amount of wealth that was hidden there. The secrecy surrounding these accounts means that billions of Reichsmarks may still lie dormant in Swiss vaults, inaccessible to the outside world. In addition to the missing gold and art, there are also the countless documents, including Nazi financial records, that were destroyed or lost in the final days of the war. The destruction of these documents was not accidental. It was an effort to erase any trace of the financial operations that had funded the Nazi regime. Many of the Reichsbank's records were burned, and the remaining files were scattered or destroyed as the Allies closed in. This deliberate destruction of evidence has made it impossible to fully reconstruct Hitler's financial empire, leaving gaps in the historical record that continue to fuel speculation. As time has passed, the hunt for these lost treasures has become a mythic pursuit. Treasure hunters, filmmakers, and historians have all sought to unlock the secrets of Hitler's fortune, with some even claiming to have found hidden caches in the mountains of Bavaria and Austria. While some discoveries, such as a few coins and Nazi artifacts, have been made, nothing on the scale of what is believed to have been hidden by the Nazis has been uncovered. Yet the possibility of new finds keeps the search alive. As recently as 2019, a group of construction workers in Poland uncovered what appeared to be wartime materials hidden in an abandoned railway station, further stoking interest in the idea that more of Hitler's lost fortune remains to be found. The mystery of Hitler's wealth is more than just a historical enigma. It is a symbol of the destructive power of greed and power, a reminder of how a single man's insatiable desire for wealth shaped the course of history. It also serves as a reflection of the human condition, of how people, driven by fear and ambition, will go to any lengths to protect what they deem valuable, even if it means committing atrocities in the process. The search for Hitler's hidden treasures is ultimately a search for meaning in the chaos of war, a way to understand what was lost and what remains, buried beneath layers of time and history. The hunt will likely never be fully resolved. As decades pass, new discoveries may be made, and new theories may emerge. But the legacy of Hitler's fortune is one that will continue to haunt us.